You may also notice the occasional here, which is just me amending the sound. So I apologize if I don't.
Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are gathered here tonight in our atrium to celebrate the launch of the second book from Chantal Fiola, Returning to Ceremony, Spirituality in Manitoba Métis Communities. I'd like to greet all of you and thank you for joining us here in our atrium, and also say a special hello to all of you watching on YouTube right now. All of you will have the opportunity to participate in this event when we do move along to the Q&A, and I'll address that in just a moment. I am keenly aware that I'm the least interesting person who will be speaking from this podium this evening, so I'll attempt to keep my own comments very succinct, but there are just a few housekeeping notes. For those of you gathered here tonight in this space, we would ask that you just remain masked for the entirety of the time that you are here. You'll notice that when the speakers do come up to the front, they may choose to remove their masks. Once we leave this space for the book signing, and I'll go over the details of that shortly after, we would ask that you not only remain masked, but also begin to socially distance, as we will be transitioning from the performance space to the retail world, which apparently necessitates different rules. So thank you all for acknowledging that. The flow of the evening is fairly straightforward. There'll be a few speakers up here first, and then we'll move along to a conversation between Chantal and Laura Forsythe, your host for this evening. That will take place at the chairs just to my left. Following the conversation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions, so feel free to formulate those in your head as the evening goes along. To all of you watching on YouTube, you are also welcome to join in the Q&A. Please just write your questions into the chat, and we'll be sure to include you as much as we can. The only thing I will request in advance, that I'll reiterate once the Q&A begins, is because it seems unwise to have everybody sharing a microphone during the times that we are in, I'll ask instead that you formulate a question, ask it to me, and I will then repeat it into the microphone, both for the benefit of all those gathered here tonight, but also for the benefit of all those gathered here at home, so that they can actually hear the questions themselves. As a result, we just very kindly and gently ask that you please do formulate it as a question rather than a statement. Please be assured that you'll have ample time to talk to Chantal during the actual signing immediately following this event, and you'll have an opportunity to chat then. Thank you for putting up with me for a little while. I'd also like to very much thank the University of Manitoba Press both for publishing this book and for helping to pull this evening together. We're so grateful for our continued partnership with you. But we have two speakers before we invite out our guest of honor. The first is a very special guest, Rainey Gawish, a Cree and Icelandic woman who acquired treaty status through Bill C-3, Indian Act Gender Equity legislative changes, and who is now a band member of Fisher River Cree Nation. She is 4th degree Midwaywan and a spiritual mentor and friend to Chantal. She is here to offer an opening prayer and some words. Please join me in welcoming her.
Ooh, I feel so free. Bonjour, Nandoi Manganadog. Sonia Wabisikwe Indigenous Wabije Shiendote. Moskego Anishinaabe Kwe Minuami Kwamiku Ikwe Endao. Wabi Agaski Sipiendunjaba Minua Uji Kwe Sipiendunjaba. My name is Rainey Gawish, Dr. Rainey Gawish, and I just introduced myself. I'm of the Martin clan. That's what this is. And I'm Cree and Icelandic ancestry. I was born and knew myself to be a half-breed for much of my life until I moved to the city. I actually had never heard the word Métis until I came here. And now I am, as a result of Bill C-3, status Indian. It really does speak to a lot of the lines that have been broken and the importance of the work that this young woman, this beautiful young woman, is doing on our behalf and on behalf of all of us. I'm going to say a prayer, and before I begin, I want to let you know I made notes for this prayer because it's a little different than I usually say. And, you know, as one of those ones who's picking up and trying to rebuild the lines that have been broken, one of the things that we've lost is our language. So there's many of us who are doing our best to restore that to ourselves and acknowledge and know how important that is to knowing who we are as people of Anishinaabe. And that's an inclusive term, Indigenous ancestry of who belong to this land, this place. Asema, I was given tobacco. Asema naminikuna, ojiandu, daganu damagayan, niganuna, anadu, gijimanadu, gichimanadu, nukumasanani, mushumasanani. Minuana ganazad manadu gishwande me, wabanang, jaunang, mangabunang, giwetanang, oede manaduk, wenje bidasa mabiwad. Ninga gwechima dash, gimashumasanan, dajawena madva kinanishnaben, minawa gukumasanan, daganude, daganu, daganu, dagana wenamad, dajawenamad anishnaben, minawa gini jana samananig da minabimada siwad, da bimi uduyang anishnabe mit bimad siwen. Nadama Shanam, Ajuena Mishanam, Vijimanido, Ajuena Mishanam, Vijimanido, Ajuena Mishanam, Vijimanido, Ajuena Mishanam, Vijimanido, Nadamadis, Nadamalishin, Nigwich, Bizendalian, and Kanigana. What I talked about in this prayer was I was given tobacco for this reason, to speak on behalf of all of us, for all of you. I call the Great Spirit and those leading spirits who sit in each of the doorways of the four directions, the east, south, west, and north. And I asked our grandfather, the Great Spirit, to love and bless and pity all of us as Anishinaabe. Anishinaabe means all of us, because in our traditions, we always welcome and included in our community all of those who visited and stayed with us. You are, to us, our relatives. I also acknowledged our grandmother, that she looks after, bless, and protects all Anishinaabe, and that our children have good lives so that we can carry this Anishinaabe life. To help us all, to bless us, Creator. And I thank you for listening. I'm really honored to be here today. I don't get to see Chantal very often. I think my motivation was, I get to see Chantal. I get to meet Nikki. I get to see her family. I was looking forward to meeting her daughter, but that'll have to be another time. I was a part of Chantal's searching just as I searched to find and restore some of the broken threads that we experience as Anishinaabe people, those broken threads of our lineage and our language, of our heritage, of our identity, of our knowing that we belong here and that this is our place. This is the sacred place that the Creator brought us to. Our footsteps have walked this earth for many generations, more than we can count. Sadly, our knowledge of those ones that walked before us, there was a deliberate attempt to break those threads of understanding and knowledge and knowing of who we are as Anishinaabe people. And Anishinaabe includes all of us, Métis, all of those artificial statuses that have been accorded to us by the government and the dominant society that now dictates so many aspects of our lives. When we think about what we're doing, there was a prophecy that Chantal has written about, may have referenced it again in this book, called The Prophecy of the Seven Fires. And that prophecy extends further back than to a time before the Europeans arrived. But our people lived a very sacred and connected to spirit life. And they were given some direction and warnings from the world of spirit and those spirits who took care of them, that our people would be facing a very challenging time, a very disrupting and devastating time. And that time would be as a result of what a new race of people who are coming here would bring. But the prophecy wasn't all dismal. It actually talked about that fundamental truth of human life is that we all have free will and we have a choice. And those people that were coming had the free will to decide whether or not what they were bringing would be chaos or would be peace and brotherhood and prosperity for all. We didn't know what was coming. We didn't know which way it would go. But the Spirit told us to prepare and said that if they come with the face of brotherhood, we will experience that. But if they come with the face of death, and we would only know the face of death by how it emerged and what we would see, the way we would see the land, what we would see, the changes we would see on the face of the land, and the changes we would see in us. That we needed to prepare for that it would threaten our very survival as people, as nations, as sacred people of this land, of children of the Creator, that we had to get ready for that. So from the West Coast and moving inward, some people took seriously the message that was given by Spirit at that time, because not everybody does, you know. There are others who kind of have to debate it and think about it and analyze it and question it and maybe decide to stay home, not move. Now we know what the outcome of that was, but still back then that prophecy that came inspired a great migration from the east of what we know now to be Algonquin-speaking nations of this Turtle Island, this part of the world. And they were carrying their sacred bundles to protect as much as they could from the devastation that possibly was going to be brought and affected on us. In that prophecy, it talked about, there would be a time, if that devastation was brought upon us, there would be a time when a new people would emerge. And what those new people would do is that they would do the work to pick up those broken threads and try and repair the fabric of our society by restoring to us our knowledge of our own history, restoring to us our languages, restoring to us our understanding of relations and kinship and who we are, our way of worship, our way of prayer, our way of understanding the Creator and hope for our future that we would transmit to our children. That's in that prophecy. Not that long ago, in 1994, there was another ceremony that was done around Lake Scugog in Ontario, where a bundle had been found, and in that bundle were remnants of that sacred bundle that was carried on the Great Migration from the East Coast. And they recognized those articles as being Medewan. And Medewan is a word is an Ojibwe word that talks about our sacred way of life. And in that, they did a ceremony, and they called forth the spirit of that one that had carried that bundle, and his footsteps walked the earth. And he identified himself as Niju Gabo, one whose footsteps are in two worlds. And the message that that spirit brought was that they were doing ceremony back then. They were doing ceremony 20, 30 generations ago, because they also seen the devastation that would come upon us. And what they were doing was they were trying to protect as much of our sacred way of life as they could and send it forward. And in sending that forward, what they also sent him forward from his time until up to ours to find out whether the work that they had done, spiritual work that they had done, had succeeded, and what they wanted to see what arrived here. What do we have now of those sacred ways that they wanted to ensure that they communicated to the generations that were coming after them, to us? And in that, what he said was, we underestimated how great the disruption would be. We underestimated how much was lost. But we see that some things did arrive here. And he finished his speaking to the people who were there by saying, "It is now up to you." So we're blessed today to hear from this young woman who is one of the ones who's picking up that work to reconnect those threads, because she understood somehow in her heart, she understood it is up to us. So for that, I'll say Nuguch for listening, and I'll turn it over to whoever's speaking next. Well, Nuguch.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gawish. I'm now introducing your host for this evening. Laura Forsythe is a PhD candidate in the Department of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba and a tenure-track faculty member in the Faculty of Education at the University of Winnipeg. Her research, including Métis in post-secondary education, focuses on Métis women's roles in educational sovereignty as knowledge producers in the academy. Forsythe's research contributions include numerous edited collections, peer-reviewed publications, academic conference paper presentations, and one of the creators of a Michif language program at the University of Manitoba. Please join me in welcoming Laura Forsythe.
Marcia, I always think they're talking about someone else. So, Tancha Kiowal, Laura Forsythe de Jacachon, ma famille Koyash Roostertown, Oshawa, but me weekend Winnipeg. So, I'm so happy to be here for Chantal, and the work that she does is incredible, but the person that she is, always supporting those that are coming behind her. I'm just so elated. I have taken tobacco. This is the first time I have been at an event outside of my house in 2 years. But when I got this invitation, I knew that I had to be here. And I was happy that it would be here on this land, because as I said, a long time ago, my family lived on this land. They farmed 149 acres of this land and now we don't live here anymore. It's another story for another day, but I hope you look into it. So let's, in the interest of time, I talk about Chantal. So Chantal Fiola is a Machip from the Red River Métis with family in St. Laurent and St. Genevieve, Manitoba. And she is the author, as we heard, of Rekindling the Sacred Fire, Métis Ancestry and Anishinaabe Spirituality. If you wanted to get that tonight, you can't because it is sold out. So if you find a copy, buy it. And it won the John Hirsch Award and the Most Promising Writer in Manitoba, and the Beatrice Pointier Aboriginal Writer of the Year Award. So if you haven't read it already, I don't know where you've been, but I know that it's available at McNally Online. And Dr. Fiola is an assistant professor in urban and inner city studies. Associate. Oh, that's right. Oh my gosh, COVID's been long. And during COVID, Dr. Fiola was promoted to associate professor. Woo! At the University of Winnipeg. And Chantal is two-spirit Wadewan, a sun dancer, and lives with her wife, Nikki, and her daughter here in Winnipeg. And so I want to welcome her so we can get to her beautiful reading of this incredible book. Chantal?
Bonjour, miigwech. Oh my gosh, I'm around other humans. I apologize if I've lost some of my social skills, but I'm really excited to be here. Thank you folks for joining. Thank you to the folks who are joining through the internet. Thank you, John, for that land acknowledgement, to Rainey for the opening prayer and the impactful words. Rainey's been a big part of my journey for a long time. Hey, Justin. Miigwech to Laura for hosting the evening and for sharing some of her personal story, her connection to this land as well. Bojon and Dinawe Magani Doug, Zagate Kwe Indishnikas, Bijune Dodem, Nin Nawe Nangwe Abe, Bejik Mide, Onemu Pokosamuin, Michifendao. My spirit name is Sunshine Through the Clouds Woman. I belong to the Lynx clan. I identify as two-spirit. I'm Midewan, a sun dancer, as was mentioned, and Michif. My communities, a couple of my communities were mentioned. I thought I would just share briefly a few words about who I am and how I came to this topic, essentially Métis relationships with traditional Indigenous spirituality, with ceremonies in particular. So like many Red River Métis people, I was raised Catholic, but I ended up walking away as a young person, a teenager. And then it was through higher education that I found my way to ceremonies. I left Manitoba for school, and I started meeting traditional folks, Midewan folks, Edna Manitowabi, Shirley Ida Williams. I met Rainey through my PhD program. And then when I moved back home, I started developing kinship relationships with nearby First Nation communities, Hollow Water, Roseau River. Charlie Nelson adopted me as a daughter. He's the chief of the Minway Midewan Lodge over there. Bad River, Shoal Lake, and also building stronger relationships with my mother's community, the historic Métis community of Senara. So let's see here. When I started going to ceremonies, I was wondering, where are the other Métis folks? And that's sort of how I got started on this track in the first place. And through my doctoral studies, I began this conversation, this larger conversation about Métis relationships with traditional Indigenous spirituality. There wasn't very much written. There still isn't very much written on this particular topic, but I've been hoping and trying to encourage folks to talk about this. So in my first book, I spent quite a bit of time talking about the reasons why so many Métis folks have become disconnected from ceremonies intergenerationally. And I spoke with 18 people with Métis ancestry who go to ceremonies. And while that book focused on individuals, with this book, I'm hoping to continue that conversation, but at the level of community. So more specifically, I've highlighted 6 Métis communities in Manitoba: Duck Bay, Camperville, Saint-Laurent, St. Francis Xavier, Lorette, and Saint-Anne. And I've been on this ongoing quest to debunk stereotypes. There's lots of stereotypes about Métis people, unfortunately. We're all familiar with them. Métis equals mixed. Métis is any mixture of Indigenous and non-Indigenous. All Métis people are Catholic. Métis people don't go to ceremonies. None of those statements is true, but there are reasons why those are such pesky stereotypes, and why so many of us, including Métis people, have internalized them. So I continued my search for evidence of Métis participation in ceremonies historically through oral history, through the archives, through more contemporary literature being published. And there are definitely, that evidence definitely exists. So I thought I would highlight a couple examples. So I was very fortunate in the summer of 2018 to spend some time with esteemed matriarch of the Métis Nation, Maria Campbell, at her land near Batoche. And so I share a bit about that in this book. And she shared with me, paraphrasing, that Métis people have been participating in ceremonies and sweat lodge for as long as Métis people have existed, except for in those communities that came to be dominated by the church, the Catholic Church, or another denomination. A historic example of Métis participation in ceremonies, some of you might be familiar with the Nehiyahuat, the Iron Confederacy, or the Iron Alliance. So this was an alliance in the early 1800s between Cree, Assiniboine, Saulteaux, and Métis people. And there was a Cree Assiniboine leader named Many Eagleset who hosted a Sundance. This was in what would become North Dakota, like in the Turtle Mountain area, which of course straddles into Manitoba. The purpose of the Sundance was to officially welcome the newcomers into the region, which were the Anishinaabe or the Saulteaux and the Michif, the Métis people. And in that ceremony, the Sundance was gifted to the Métis people and the Anishinaabe, along with a Unity of the People song. And then more recently, in 2003, there was a ceremony in those lands again to commemorate that earlier Sundance, and that song was sung again. And then another example that I learned of in the journey that led to this book is that Gabriel Dumont, one of the most famous Métis people ever, participated in ceremonies. You know, so his dad put him on a vision quest before puberty, and he had a vision that gained him the ability to call the bison. Of course, he's a renowned bison hunter, and also performed doctoring rites. He was well versed with traditional medicines, made use of tobacco and sweetgrass. I read a story about how he had woven a braid of sweetgrass into the shape of a cross and carried that with him everywhere. And a story about how he smudged Riel's grave and the mourners at Riel's funeral. He was a firekeeper for Sweat Lodge. He built them, he sweat in them, he was a pipe carrier, he attended Sundance. And I think so many Métis people, we've become disconnected from our own stories. So, and we have internalized these messages that we don't go to ceremonies. And so if more folks knew about these stories, and so he's a famous leader, but it wasn't just the famous leaders, like regular Métis people, some of us historically participated in ceremonies as well. Another place that you can find evidence of historic Métis participation in ceremonies is the archives. So I did a deeper dive into the archives, and found additional examples of this. I think, though, I was going to read an excerpt, but in the interest of time, I want to make sure that I share some of the excerpts from the participants. But essentially, the first priests that came to Manitoba, or what would become Manitoba in 1818, they wrote to their superiors in Montreal. And while they exaggerate their success in converting Indigenous folks, you can also find examples of their frustration that while Métis folks go to church, they also continue to participate in ceremonies, not just Métis folks, First Nation as well, including the Medewin, including Sundance. And so I talk about that in here and give some specific examples. I also wanted to continue speaking with Métis people in the here and now who participate in ceremonies. So with the help of 6 Métis community researchers, we spoke with 32 Red River Métis people who go to ceremonies. I did my best to craft a Métis methodology. If folks are interested in that, we can talk about that maybe during the Q&A. In the book, I also offer a brief introduction to each of those 6 historic Métis communities, including origins, the arrival of clergy, the advent of formal education, especially in the form of residential and day schools, and also historic and contemporary population statistics. So the folks we spoke with shared stories and experiences about their family history, their family relationships with community, culture, identity, religion, spirituality. And they also shared personal stories about their relationships with identity and also their personal relationships with religion and spirituality. So briefly, I wanted to highlight just some of the themes that came up in people's stories. So with regards to Métis family relationships with Métis communities, there are intergenerational, multiple generations of families connected to a single Métis community. And the Métis folks in this book are connected to multiple Métis communities. The list of Métis communities that people are connected to is extensive. It's beautiful. In terms of, so unsurprisingly, almost everybody, in fact, everybody except for one family had strong connections with Catholicism. I do want to read an excerpt from Louis, who's connected to Saint Anne, to give you a sense of what this connection to Catholicism looked like. So Louis shared, the way to rise above the poverty, to rise above the discrimination, was to show how devout you were as Catholics. This was your Métishood. That was who you were. It had to do with being a choir boy. It had to do with being altar boys from a young age. It had to do with showing up for church and having 12 people from your family fill up 2 pews, and then you were proud. If you weren't Catholic, you could not elevate yourself. You could not find work. There was going to be no hope for you to get out of poverty and misery. So while many Métis folks did ask for a priest in their community, in the first book, I show how increasingly over time there was pressures to convert. And whereas historically we might have gone to church and ceremonies, that was less and less okay over time. And so like Louis mentioned here, it became like a form of survival for your family to be like super Catholic. Some participants also spoke about traditional Indigenous spirituality in their families and their communities while they were growing up. So here's an example. Louise and Brenda from Camperville and George from neighboring Duck Bay indicated that while they were growing up, they were aware of Indigenous ceremonies in their community historically, specifically the Sundance, Midewin, Shake Tent, and Sweat Lodge. Louise explained, I got a really big book about land surrender and Métis land script called Pine Creek First Nation and Duck Bay Surrender. That's part of our community and what happened. Also, it goes into great length about Camperville and practicing the Midewin and Sundance ceremonies historically. George said something similar about Duck Bay. He said, there were ceremonies held in my community. The shake tent was brought there by the elders. There's a certain part there. If you drive across the lake, they used to hold ceremonies there. In the 1800s, all the tribes from all around there went to have a gathering in September or August. They brought the shake tent there twice because two twin brothers drowned and they wanted elders to help them, wise men to find where the bodies went down, where they'd be. That was in the 1950s, so not so very long ago. The folks that we spoke with participate in multiple kinds of ceremonies, like 2 to 16 distinct kinds of ceremonies. They talked about factors that work to inhibit their reconnection to ceremony and also factors that nurtured their reconnection to ceremonies. Just looking at the time here. So, and there were also like community specific patterns that arose. So for example, St. Anne, Lorette, and St. Francis Xavier, the non-Indigenous population now outnumbers their Indigenous population. So they spoke about greater pressures of assimilation. They were more likely, like through the generations in their family, to be like pushed out of their Métis community. So they have, they might have connections to a greater number of Métis communities for this reason. They were also less likely to be aware of their historic family connections to ceremony and more likely to report self-doubt and internalizing stereotypes about Métis identity and spirituality. On the other hand, Duck Bay, Camperville, and Saint-Laurent continue to have a higher Indigenous population than a non-Indigenous one. So we see stronger intergenerational residence patterns staying in one Métis place. We also see least variation in self-identity. So while most of the people in the study identify as Métis or Michif, some folks also identified with other like proper nouns. That was least likely in the communities that retained a greater Indigenous than non-Indigenous population. Also, so Métis folks at this point in time are very likely to leave their Métis community in search of ceremonies because of the legacy of colonization. And sometimes they travel a great distance, like to Alberta, depending on the spiritual community, like the spiritual home that they find. But the stories are also showing that increasingly ceremonies are becoming available and accessible in some Métis communities. So Duck Bay, for example, Sundance returned in the last few years, which is very exciting. Some of the participants talked about having ceremony on their own land. So I read an excerpt from Louis. He hosted Sundance on his property just outside of St. Anne. Some of the folks have hosted fasting camps on their property. I wanted to share an excerpt from Charlotte, who's also connected to St. Anne, about a fasting camp that she hosted on her property. And you can hear some of the challenges that folks overcome as well. It was funny because I told everybody, I'm going to be putting up red prayer flags at the four corners, the directions to come to our place. So they all found the place easily. There were about 300 people that showed up. After the fast ended, I went to take the flags down and burn them in a sacred fire, but they were all gone. So I thought, because I put them at the road signs, maybe the municipality picked them up. So I went to the municipality and said, did you guys pick up 4 red flags at 4 different intersections? He said, yeah, one of your neighbors came and told us there was going to be an Indian uprising. all these native people heading to your place. And I burst out laughing. I says, oh my God, next time you talk to him, tell him to come over for tea and ask me about it. I says, if he would have had tea in Bannock with us, we would have helped him understand what this was about. And they all chuckled after that, gave me the flags, and I brought them home. But you see, people fear things because they don't understand them. And then I wanted to share one final excerpt. So some of the participants have erected sweat lodges in their yards, in their Métis communities. And this is a story about that shared by Giripet from Saint-Laurent. She shared, when we built the sweat lodge in my yard, the priest came. Father Michel was Métis. He would talk to me about spirituality and ceremony. He'd have sage in the house where he lived. I went and cleaned that sage for him one time, and I did some teachings about sage. He always said he wanted to know more, and he wanted to participate in ceremony. So on the day that we were building the sweat lodge, I invited him. He came and dropped by with his holy water, and he was doing his holy water thing on the sweat lodge. She starts to chuckle on the ground. So I asked her, when the priest came and blessed your sweat lodge with holy water, was he doing it in like a friendly and encouraging way? She said, oh yeah. I said, okay, because I heard some other stories about them doing it in like a remove the devil kind of way, but I didn't get that feeling from your story. She said it was neat because that same summer that we did that, there was a woman that came to the lodge. She's very Catholic and she felt really good being there in the sweat because Father Michel had blessed it with holy water. So she felt like it was okay. And she kept chuckling. So you get a sense of some of the barriers and challenges, but you also get a sense of how people are overcoming these barriers and finding their way back to ceremonies. So I'll just end by sharing some of my goals and hopes for doing work like this. I'm hoping to create space for other Métis folks to feel comfortable and find their way back to ceremonies. Like Rainey mentioned, reconnecting the threads in our family. As Métis people, some of our ancestors participated in ceremonies, and some Métis people today continue to participate in ceremonies. I'm also hoping to, I think Rainey mentioned this too, help heal the relationships, the kinship relationships between Métis people and First Nations people. Always trying to debunk those stereotypes about us. And I offer one way of understanding Métis spirituality. So instead of that stereotype that all Métis are Christian or Catholic in particular, my hope is that people will think, will understand Métis spirituality existing on a continuum with Christianity on one end and traditional Indigenous spirituality on the other, and beautiful syncretic blends of both in the center. And my hope is that folks will come to recognize or remember that Métis spirituality includes ceremonies in its own right, and that that's not a new thing. That was true for us historically, and it's increasingly true for an ever greater number of us today. I think I'll stop there. I always try to back away from these things.
So I want to begin this conversation, and I didn't mention it before, but my family walked away from the Catholic Church 2 generations ago, and I've never been in a sweat lodge. And I came to this book, and I come to this conversation wanting to learn and wanting to know more about what people have practiced, what they are practicing, and potential new connections for those watching on YouTube, those in the crowd, and everyone who's going to read the book. That's where we're starting. We're gonna go from there. And so I want to talk about how the book is grounded. And so when you have your copy, you'll see that it starts with, "My purpose here is not to discourage Métis people from having a relationship with Christianity. Rather, it is simply to encourage the understanding that some Métis people participate in ceremonies instead of or alongside Christianity." Why was it important to you to ground the book that way?
For a couple different reasons. Firstly, out of respect. So when I started going to ceremonies, one of the first teachings that was shared with me was about respect, and that we don't push our views onto other people. We don't push our spiritual or traditional views onto others, but instead we're open and we share. And if people are interested, they'll come. So I didn't want to replicate harmful patterns that have been imposed upon us. So many people, like Métis people, have relationships with Catholicism, and that can be a beautiful thing. I'm just trying to illuminate that those parts of our story, our collective story, that have been erased and that we've been forced to forget. And I recognize that some Métis folks, including some Métis elders, including some Métis leadership, are very staunchly Catholic, and are not excited about hearing about this type of thing. But I'm hoping that if I move forward respectfully, and if they listen to the voices of all these other Métis folks who have found fulfillment in traditional Indigenous spirituality and ceremonies, that we'll start to heal our memories almost, that our stories will come back to us.
I think one important element that you mentioned today would be quite surprising to many staunch Métis Catholics, the fact about Gabriel Dumont. So I think that's going to open the door well. Now, chapter 3 explores your Métis-centered study and approach. So for non-academics, why is how we do things through a Métis lens something to consider?
So again, in an effort not to replicate super harmful, exploitative research practices that have been imposed upon Indigenous folks, Métis included, it's important to think ethically and deeply about our approach to research. So for this study, like I mentioned, I tried my best to craft a Métis-specific approach. The fancy academic word for that is methodology. Aspects of that are that it is grounded in a Métis worldview. The criteria for participating in this story and in this research was like the Métis National Council definition of Métis, being connected to specific Métis communities, so 6 particular ones in this case, and folks who go to ceremonies. Also, I had mentioned that I was fortunate to receive some SHRC funding through the Manitoba Research Alliance, and I hired 6 Manitoba Métis community researchers. So these folks, like one for each community, they were already part of these communities. They already had relationships there. And so they helped me, because I only had connections to like half of the communities. And so they helped me navigate relationship building essentially, so that I wouldn't just push my way into communities, and instead I could meet people, be introduced, be welcomed. Another aspect was the Manitoba Métis Federation has this MCREP process, the Manitoba Métis Community Research Ethics Protocol. So it's essentially guidelines for how to do research in Manitoba Métis communities in an ethical way. And I worked with them to do that. So part of that was I was introduced to the vice presidents of the regions that would be impacted by my study. We had meetings, they had an opportunity to ask me questions or ask me to make some changes. And they were helpful in introducing me to some people that became important through the research journey and have been generally supportive. And we continue that relationship now. Unfortunately, the branch of the MMF that housed this program no longer exists. So I'm hopeful that they're going to figure out how to continue helping researchers in this way because it's important and it promotes like Métis self-determination and Métis sovereignty.
Mhm. And I know that Manitoba Métis Federation is making this a priority for them and working through their senior policy analysts to ensure that us researchers, when we're reaching out to the Métis community, are doing so in a good way. And I think that academics are going to be really excited about the chapter on methodology because it is incredible. Now, the book explores the relationship to ceremony in the 6 communities you mentioned already. So Doug Fay, Camperville, St. Laurent, St. Francis Xavier, Lorette, and St. Anne's. For those unfamiliar with your other works, why not Winnipeg?
So my first book was essentially grounded in Winnipeg. Most of the people that I spoke with for that one came from or continued to live in Winnipeg. And also, you know, larger urban areas tend to get a lot of airtime and resources. So it's harder to hear the stories coming from like rural Métis communities. So, and I see this as kind of like a progression. But the first book focused on individual experiences. This one is focusing on like a community lens. And then my next project, which I've just started, is focusing on like the larger Métis Nation. So looking at specific historic Métis communities like across, or at least one from across the prairies. That's why.
Now, we've talked a lot about ceremony tonight, but this book goes beyond ceremony, and it includes the exploration of language, identity, relationship with the land, with our relatives, and Catholicism. Why did you feel the need to tell a holistic story?
So I mentioned earlier that Métis folks are often reduced to like a stereotype. And we've come to internalize these stereotypes. And there are parts of our story that we've been disconnected from. So the ceremony part is an important part of our identity, our collective history that has been taken from us bit by bit, increasingly, intergenerationally. And some of you might be familiar with this concept of race shifting that's happening. And so at this point in time, okay, for folks who might not be familiar, race shifting is this phenomenon. Like when I say it, I mean specifically white settler, often French Canadians, who recently traced their family tree and found one Native person like 200 to 400 years ago, and then starts calling themselves Métis and wants Métis rights and starts speaking on behalf of Métis people, which then confuses everybody. And so even though with this book, in a sense, I'm trying to broaden the understanding of Métis Nation identity and community, I'm doing that at a difficult time because people are like, the Métis Nation is, some people in the Métis Nation are trying to close ranks and like protect Métis Nation sovereignty from this increasing phenomenon. But like I mentioned, this is already part of our story, you know, like learning about these historic Métis communities and that there were ceremonies practiced in those communities historically. And the fact they're coming back now, it's not new. It's just we're remembering, we're reconnecting, and it's an important part of our identity. So again, in a sense, it seems like I'm broadening our identity, but I'm not. I'm helping us remember that this is a legitimate part of our identity and our collective story.
Yeah, absolutely. As I read each of the individual stories, all 32 of them, talking about those identifiers that are so clearly Métis, but so varied. I just saw the people that I know in community and I could see them. I could see each of them. Now I know many of them, but I could see others who shared that story. and that our understanding or the story of the narrative that we're telling about Métis people right now at this time is not fair to our ancestors, and it certainly doesn't represent our grandmothers, which is a tangent I could go on. But we don't have time for that. What we are going to do is we're going to open the floor to those who have a burning question. So here comes John and his mic.
Yes, indeed. So if you do have a question, please feel free to raise your hand, and I'll just ask you to ask me, at which point I will repeat it into the speaker. And again, if you are one of those folks watching on YouTube, please do feel free to write any question you might have in the comments.
Do you want me to rephrase or paraphrase that, John? So, correct me if I've misunderstood, but I think Rainey is talking about, so one of the elders in the Three Fires Midday, Jim Dumont, talks about how, despite the legacy of colonization, Anishinaabe, in this case, families have retained like some deep, distinct, nation-specific, cultural and spiritual knowledge in the form of values. Am I saying this? Yeah, okay. And so you're asking, did the folks in this book talk about that? I would say that they did. So the community researchers and I asked about family relationships with First Nations, with First Nations culture, with Métis culture, and also with settler culture. And so as part of that, absolutely, like people would say things like, you know, we never, when we grew up, we never had conversations around the dinner table about the fact that we're Métis or Michif, but we come from Michif communities, and the people in the communities are Michif. And as an adult and thinking back, it becomes clear to me that the values that have been instilled in our families are very like Métis specific values around like the importance of our elders, of family, of kinship relationships. So I would say that, yeah, that did come up. Okay.
Okay. So I come from a family, two families, the Gendrons from Saint-Anne-des-Chênes and Ségalt, which is in Saint-Laurent, of course, and the Tétros, which are the Brokery and Leroy, North Dakota. And the thing that I found that growing up is that there was pushback in the community, in both communities. And there was a lot of pressure to denigrate, make subtle slurs about our heritage. And so I'm just wondering, when you went into Saint-Anne-des-Chênes or you went to Lorette, did you find that you were getting some pushback from the community regarding helping people to reclaim their histories?
Good question. So did I experience pushback? So while it's certainly true what you mentioned, that some Métis families and also non-Indigenous families who are living in these communities have over time internalized negative stereotypes about Métis people, including like within our own families. And there's very good reason, sad reasons for this. I talk about that a lot in the first book. I didn't really experience like outward pushback. I think I might have been, maybe I wasn't sheltered from that by the process, the way that I entered communities, which I mentioned was through people that were already connected. And so I was kind of brought in there and protected in a way, but the participants themselves did share stories absolutely about feeling denigrated or this pushback that you're talking about in their communities or in their own families sometimes when they're trying to reconnect with ceremonies. Yeah, I'm trying to think of a specific example. So something that's coming to mind, I mentioned Louis, who's connected to Saint Anne actually, he shared a story about how in their own family, in their own Métis family, they had internalized these like sad, bad views about Métis people and about First Nations. And so they lived relatively close to a First Nation, and they were taught like, don't fraternize with the First Nations. If their car breaks down, like we're not supposed to help them. And Louis like, what? They look like us, like why? And we're supposed to be Catholic. We're supposed to help and love our neighbors. So like, there's this like incongruity that he was able to like overcome over time. And it's not surprising, sadly, that some families have internalized these things. So I'm not blaming his family. Like, unfortunately, that's kind of a common thing. Hopefully that's decreasing. But there are very specific reasons, like having to do with the legacy of colonization, that is the case. But I'm happy to report that it was mostly like a very positive, like people are like increasingly, I'm finding the Métis people that go to ceremonies are excited about this and want to talk about it. It's just maybe some other pockets that are taking a little bit longer to warm up to the idea.
In the chapter that talks about self-identification, it really dives into this idea of what individuals have experienced in terms of racism and pushback and who they are and how they feel about it. So it's an incredible chapter that I think will speak to a lot of Métis experience, regardless of community that they're from. Yeah.
And we do have time for one more question. Ask one out there, physically or virtually. Yes.
Okay, I'll just talk loud. Hi. So you talked a lot about Medellin, but I'm wondering, because the Dumonts are coming from the west, from Ferguson, or not Ferguson, from Edmonton, right? And they're I'm just wondering if you saw different influences of Nefiao and especially the west influences in
Also a really good question. So in the research that I did, first of all, it sounds like people are not certain about the birthplace of Gabriel Dumont, but the best educated guess seems to be like Saint Boniface. So I would say that yes, depending on where your family was intergenerationally situated or the mobility your family might have had intergenerationally and your kinship relationships, you might see different influences, like a stronger Anishinaabe influence in your family, especially if there's been intermarriage with that particular nation in your family, versus a Nehiao or a Plains Cree impact or influence in your family. That's actually a question that I'm going to keep in mind in this part 3 of this larger story. So I just was named the University of Winnipeg Distinguished Indigenous Scholars Chair. And as part of that, I get to do, thank you, I get to do this really cool work. And I'm going to be collaborating with Dr. Palgero. And we're going to be looking at historic Métis communities across the prairies. And so that's going to be something that I want to keep in mind to see if we do see those impacts and differences depending on where we're situated in things. So stay tuned, David.
So great. So I've already said how wonderful I think this book is and how much I think everyone should read it. But I recently joined the Faculty of Education. So now I teach Indigenous Studies. And for the first time since celebrating that, I felt badly I wasn't going to get to teach Métis Studies because I felt that this book needed to be on that syllabus, that the conversations that happen in these stories shared by these 32 people needed to be taught to not only Métis, but non-Indigenous folks to have a better understanding of who we are and where we're going. And so I want to thank you for writing this book so that we can share this knowledge with everyone who needs it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. So I wrote down some thank yous because I knew I'd be nervous, and this is for a more fulsome thank yous, check the acknowledgements. But a big hearty thank you again to the University of Manitoba Press team for helping bring both of my books to life. Thank you to McNally Robinson for hosting, and happy 40th anniversary, yay! Miigwech to Rainey for that opening prayer and those deep words. The Seven Fires prophecy has really impacted me along the way. Miigwech to Laura for agreeing to host and MC, and you did a fabulous job. Rainey, I mean, Laura is everywhere and does everything. She's just, I feel tired when I think about everything Laura does. I see some participants and community researchers in the audience. So a special miigwech, thank you very much to those folks for helping out along the way and being here. I want to acknowledge again the 6 historic Métis communities featured in the book. So Duck Bay, Camperville, Canada, St. Francis Xavier, Nada, and St. John. Thank you to the MMF for their support for the MPrep process. I also want to say miigwech to my lodge families, the Minway Gun, the Three Fires in a Day, the Blacksmith Sundance family. A heartfelt miigwech to my ancestors, my biological family, my extended family, my in-laws for always rooting for me. Miigwech to my brilliant wife, Nikki, for her endless love and her constructive feedback, her editing skills. And to our beautiful daughter for reminding me of the larger picture and encouraging me to lay down good tracks to follow. And miigwech everyone for being here, and everybody joining virtually. Miigwech.
Merci, thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you all very, very much. I'm just going to close with some quick housekeeping notes. In just a moment, we'll be moving Chantal to the signing table, which is located immediately beside our central cash desk. So we'll ask you all to just remain seated for just a second. And then essentially, as soon as we've left, give us a breath, and then you can wander over. Again, we will be leaving the performance space and entering the retail world. So we ask that you do please socially distance outside here. You will also notice that the store is actually closed. Please rest assured that you will not be kicked out. The cash tills are open until around 8:20, so please do feel free to purchase a copy of the book before you get in line. There are copies of the book that are available at the central cash desk, so you don't need to run around to try to find them. There will also be some extras at the signing table as well. I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to the University of Manitoba Press, and of course to all of tonight's participants, to all of you joining us here in person and virtually as well. This video will remain up if you'd like to revisit it or watch it again. And I'd ask you all to join me one final time in offering a round of applause for Rainey Gawish, Laura Forsythe, and of course, Chantal Fiola. Have a lovely evening, everyone.